here today. It's a treat. And you'll notice there's 2 pages of the handout, so possibly we'll get to the second page pertaining to the Psalms. I want to begin giving most of our time to wisdom in the Old Testament. It seems natural to go to wisdom literature. And there are 2 kinds of wisdom literature, you'll see. One is philosophical. It's called speculative wisdom. And we have that example in Job and Ecclesiastes. And this is where the authors address the big life issues, such as life and death, the possibility of an afterlife, the meaning of life, justice, the origin of evil. And in the ancient Near East, this is well represented. For example, in Babylon, you have a figure, what we call the Babylonian Job, who deals with the whole issue of justice and the way in which life has soured because of the anger of the gods. And so this is a concern across the ancient world, and why would that be so? Well, it's because we all share in common the human need for addressing these kinds of questions. But there's also practical wisdom, concrete working out how do we employ wisdom when it comes to day-to-day living. And this is also found, particularly in Egypt. You have extensive sections of practical wisdom, some of which sound like it came right out of the Bible. And why is it that you would find that kind of similarity between what you find in Egypt and what God has given us through the book of Proverbs? Well, again, there's the common overlap. Just because we are all in a social environment, then there's the issues of, well, how do I progress effectively in the circles in which I live? Family and bureaucracy and other pertinent things such as material wealth, monies, things of that sort. And so when it comes to Proverbs, we have a good representation of the thinking across the ancient Near East, because wisdom was an international property. Do you remember in the case of Solomon how Queen Sheba came to learn from King Solomon? So in all of these high cultures, you had a real interest in wisdom and in learning. Well, what about this word wisdom? We throw it around as though we all know what we're talking about. But I think what I found is that there's a tendency to think of wisdom as database, people with knowledge. Now, if you have a few miles on your life, you know that's not really the case, is it? There are people we come across, often the elders, who maybe don't know much about various aspects of life. Maybe they're not well trained and educated with liberal arts education, but they are very perceptive and they have wisdom. So there's something to be said about employed knowledge. And wisdom, and I've written the word here, the Hebrew word, it's not choke ma, but chok is a R-C-H, chokhmah. It's actually a feminine form of a noun. And that's why you have the personification as women. So, for example, you'll have lady wisdom. Or opposite. What would be the opposite of the moral, upstanding, godly lady wisdom? That would be the prostitute. So you have the building on the gender of the Hebrew term. And I think that's why we have the depiction in Proverbs 31 of the ideal wife. It's because the ideal there has to do with the way in which she employs wisdom. when we look at this word, we will find that this word primarily has to do with skill. Wisdom has to do with skill in living. You might think of it as skillful living. And this is evident from the way in which this word is used, and I've given us an example how skill, this word translated skill, is used in technical work. And so in the building of the tabernacle, there God instructs Moses, you shall speak to all the skillful, whom I have filled, here's our word, Chokhmah, I have filled with a spirit of skill, that they make Aaron's garments to consecrate him for my priesthood. So you can see it has a very practical application of dealing with the making of garments, because it does take a skill. Oh, I could give you the illustration of what it was like for me many years ago in my baking days. I was not really a trained professional chef or a pastry baker. But from time to time, I would take a good old reliable Betty Crocker and I would read the instructions. Now, I remember that I was a pretty highly educated person, and I knew the language quite well, and I could understand every instruction that was given. As a matter of fact, I could have rewritten the instructions. I was fluent enough to where I could have taken the active voice and put it in the passive voice. I could have come up with synonyms. I could have actually drawn a linguistic diagram, but I wasn't skilled. What I found after I baked a chocolate cake is as I cut into the cake, there was at the bottom of the cake a thin layer of flour. What I had done is I put too much flour in the pan. But it was easy enough to resolve. I just kind of cut the flour off and kept moving. But that's the difference between you see knowledge and skill, knowledge and wisdom. And I've given you a couple of other great examples. This is true of metal work and also even battle tactics. That's why we have people go to our military colleges and universities. So not just that they will learn the history and be able to recite the history of great battles, but also they'll be able to take that and translate it into actually a battle scene of their own. Battle tactics. And also we find that the word chokhmah is used for social skill. Let's turn to it in Proverbs 30. Here we have verses 24 to 28. Proverbs 30, 24 to 28. This is a remarkable little proverb. It talks about how the things which are so small and vulnerable nonetheless survive. 4 things on earth are small, yet they are extremely skillful. Wise. Verse 25, ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. See, that's how they can survive. Conies or rock badgers are creatures of little power, yet they make their home in the crags. This would, of course, be little niches or caves in the rocks, which give them that protection. Locusts have no king, yet they advance together in ranks. They have some kind of radar sonar to where they naturally, intuitively form ranks and devastate whatever is in front of them. A lizard can be caught with the hand, yet it is found in kings' palaces. And I could translate this into roaches can be stomped out. And yet they are found in my palace. And that's my husbandly duty, is that in addition to solving all the world's problems, such as our war on terror, or nuclear activities, things of that sort, in addition to all of that, I'm the person who kills the roaches. So you can see then that there is a correlation in the use of this word for wisdom, and that is the application of knowledge with the view of either achieving something successfully or surviving in a social setting successfully. Now, in order to understand the proper orientation, I'd like for us to turn to, actually I have it here on your handout, the prologue to the book of Proverbs. And in these verses, we will find some key lexical items that I think will serve as opening up the windows for us to understand what wisdom is about. The primary thing for you to take away from this, if I could say it at the outset, is verse 7, which is really the motto for wisdom, whether it's in Proverbs or elsewhere. And you know verse 7, most likely. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Let me point out something to you, and then we'll come back and look at that more carefully. Knowledge is, wisdom is relational. The expression fear of the Lord is the common expression throughout the Bible in the Old Testament for worship. It's highly relational. So it's not abstract, it's not apart from you, but it is very much centered in your relationship with the Lord. This is one of the presuppositions and assumptions of wisdom in the Bible. You can go to Mesopotamia, you can go to Egypt, you can go to Hittite land, which is today modern Turkey, and you'll find deposits of wisdom across centuries. But what makes Proverbs different in many ways is that it assumes a covenant relationship between God and the person who is practicing wisdom. Wisdom is relational. So let's look then, after verse 1, which is our introduction, verse 2. And for gaining wisdom and instruction. Let's start with this word, gaining wisdom and instruction. That word actually means to know. So to know wisdom and instruction is not, again, just simply accumulating facts, but it means that you gain and acquire the, here's our word, wisdom, skill. And that's what the book of Proverbs is about. And that's really about all of wisdom. And that is to train. And this is an important feature in the thinking of the Bible, because what is proclaimed, whether it be in the time of Moses or the Apostle Paul, is seen as transgenerational. That's the primary means of Christian education, is the family setting. It's transgenerational, and that's why in Proverbs you'll have the address of my son. The thinking is the Proverbs may well have come out of the setting, we don't know for sure, of the court. And so whether it be the king or nobility, what they are doing in Proverbs is passing on knowledge and practical application of how to rule, how to succeed in life. So that's the purpose of knowledge. It's actually translated for gaining, not just to know, but for gaining, acquire wisdom. And then let's go to our word instruction. Now the word instruction here means training. It means stern discipline. And by the study of wisdom, not only do you gain skill, but you will be a person in training, a person of discipline. And this would require then intensity of intentional study and reflection. Next, in verse 2, it says, for understanding words of insight. Now that word understanding is a good rendering. Other words that might help us would be to perceive. Especially when you have the expression words of insight. Then that means someone who is perceptive, someone who is discerning, someone who is able to differentiate, to distinguish. But it has to be on the right criteria. How do you differentiate? How do you perceive? Well, you have criteria upon which you make a decision, gain that insight. What would be the appropriate criteria, do you think, in the mind of the ancient sage? It'd be the word of the Lord. That would be the criteria, such as we find with the motto, the fear of the Lord. Let's move on to verse 3. For receiving instruction in prudent behavior. For receiving, that word also means to know. So the first rendering was gaining. Now the second rendering of the same word, to know, is receiving instruction. So there has to be an openness to instruction. If a person is going to be a dialogue partner or a student, or perhaps you're training someone in a particular occupation, you've got to have a willing partner. And that's what we have here. We've got to have, if you're going to gain knowledge, if you're going to receive instruction, then you have to have a willing student, someone who's submissive and sees the value of this instruction. And notice that it translates into prudent behavior. That's a different Hebrew word than what we find for wisdom, chokhmah. And it's in some ways like that word, chokhmah, but what it emphasizes is success. Success in the way you behave, in the way you act. It has this idea of just simply having good common sense. Now, have you ever come across someone who is perhaps very learned, that they have a high school degree, maybe a college degree, maybe they're a professional, but they just don't seem to have very good common sense? And this is one thing that Proverbs will provide, is success in the sense of good common sense. Well, how do you impart common sense to someone? Frankly, I wouldn't know how to do it, but according to the sage, it's reading the book of Proverbs. It's being someone who is intentionally studying the way in which certain causes lead to certain effects. And that's why Proverbs is rooted in creation theology. It's because, as we will learn, Sages were great observers of the way in which the world worked. And they did so at the natural level. And they understood that causes in the natural world, you plant your seeds, you get your harvest. It's a very dark, cloudy day. Well, what do you think might happen? You might get some rain out of that. Just these simple observations in life, of nature. Well, they began to see also in parallel that not only had God created the world to work in harmony, in some sense of regularity and expectation, from causes to effects, that this is true also in the social world. That there are certain causes that will lead to certain effects. Now, you could take some rather fantastic example. But some people aren't, I guess they're in a desperate situation, but if you fool around too much with barbiturates, or heroin, or booze, what's the effect? If you fool around too much with sexual indiscretions, and the prostitute is calling you, come to the house of prostitution, what kind of effect is that going to have on the way that you view human sexuality, the way you view people of the opposite gender or same gender, and what this might mean down the road in your marital life? Or if you're already married, something that might happen in that world that would destroy your marriage. And the reason why this is written to young people is because, in part, they haven't had enough experience at the social level to recognize causes lead to effects. But of course, young people, and I think we too, older folk, we are the exceptions, right? We can do this practice or that practice, and we're going to escape the effect. Well, what we have here is that by submitting openly to the work of God through the ancient sage or wise person, God will teach us to be aware of how causes lead to effects, and we are not the exception. And that's why it says prudent behavior. Wisdom always shows itself in the biblical view in your behavior. Process is important as the outcome, because if you notice what follows, doing what is right and just and fair. Now, here we have what is so all-important when it comes to wisdom, and that is there is a moral component. The wise person is a moral person. A wise person is a godly person. The Bible does not differentiate one's knowledge and one's behavior. The knowledge has an effect on the way that you practice your life. So a person who's going to be successful, have good sense about them, translates into prudent behavior, the process of achieving that is doing what is moral and upright. Where does a person learn what is moral and upright? Not only, of course, the examples of others, but also the motto, the fear of the Lord. Entering into that relationship, sustaining that relationship through worship. So we might reduce it briefly to this kind of formulation, and that is a person of wisdom is a godly person. A person of wisdom is a person that has a depth of relationship with the living God. So this means that our churches, if we're doing a good job in submitting to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, we should be just full of wise people. practicing their lives in an appropriate behavior. Verse 4, forgiving prudence to those who are simple. Let's deal with that word, simple. The parallel, knowledge and discretion to the young. Simpletons tend to be young. There are vast exceptions to that. What the word simpleton means is it's not that they're intellectually incompetent. Maybe that they're not educationally incompetent. But again, because of their youth, it's not only the youth, but tends to be the young. The word simple here has to do with someone who's naive. Naive. This is someone who is very open to suggestion. This is where you have what we call peer pressure. Someone who is subject to and open to persuasion. This is a person that is blown about, as the book of James says, by every wind that blows through. The person that is subject to what is said at the office, or in the neighborhood, or at the club, watching the TV program, and instead of thinking and reflecting through the prism and the grid of the fear of the Lord, they don't really have that worldview, and they're just simply open to the power of suggestion. But this teaching is designed to help the simpleton move to the mature. Verse 5, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. While we've been talking about how this is primarily directed toward the young and the unexperienced, and those who are open to suggestion and such, there's also something to be had in the study of wisdom by those who are already practicing wisdom. So, do you ever wonder why people keep coming back to church? I mean, are we so intellectually incompetent that we don't quite get the story? After once or twice on Sunday, don't you think we get it? I mean, I don't have to keep going to the same seminars over and over and over how to do a rose garden. I just go down here to one of these mega garden centers and go through the little teaching scenario and start doing my own. Or ask my neighbor, how did you get such a wonderful garden? Why do we keep coming back again and again and again? Because of the depth and profundity of what it means to know God. I mean, God's pretty deep. He's not shallow. One conversation doesn't take care of it. So even though we have some knowledge, and even if we are practicing wisdom, there's more we have, more to be gained. Going on then, let the discerning get guidance. Now this is a fascinating word, because the word is related to a term for a ship's ropes. And the ship's ropes are used for direction, hence guidance is the way it's translated. We kind of have a colloquial expression that draws on that notion of ropes. And we say, to know the ropes. To know the ropes. And that's similar to what's taking place here. Let the discerning, see, this is someone who's along the road. Let the discerning get guidance. In other words, know how to succeed by manipulating the ropes. Then we'll go to verse 6. In verse 6, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. an interesting catalog, isn't it? You have Proverbs. Now, a proverb is a terse saying that draws on earthy analogies. It's very concrete. It draws on agriculture, it draws on herds, it draws on botany and the like, family life, family accord, all of just the common daily occurrences. That's what a proverb does. It teaches you something that is profound, but the technique is to draw an analogy that's already understandable. And then you bring in to parallel that the instruction. Oh, that's sort of like illustrating, isn't it? That's what a parable is too, by the way. A simile is where you compare two things, if you remember that. And that's what a parable is. It's this extended simile or comparison. And usually when we think of parables, we think of Jesus teaching the kingdom of heaven. And remember how he would say, he'd give a simile. The kingdom of heaven is like. And then he would go on to tell the story. So really a parable is a story. But you have to discern the significance of how that story relates to the kingdom of God. And then a saying, I think we know what that is. That is really a proverbial saying in that it's passed down from generation to generation. And then a riddle, well, we can think of Samson's riddle and how in the case of Samson's riddle, remember if you resolve that, but it's perplexing. It's a challenging kind of saying. Now let's back up a little bit. Verse 6, for understanding Proverbs parable. So this has to do with insight gained. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and knowledge. That's what wisdom literature is about. Wisdom has to do with the rubric, the template, contrasting the wise and the foolish. Now, we're not talking about someone who is ignorant. We're not talking about someone's IQ even. When we talk about someone who is foolish in the book of Proverbs and elsewhere, this is a person who is immoral. How many people, young people especially, in our churches, in our Sunday school classes, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, are wonderfully trained, skilled in their occupation. So you look at someone who's maybe a physician or very successful in accounting, and they have all of this training at the undergraduate level and into professional schools. Or you can take the plumber, who's maybe a master plumber. They have all of these wonderful skills and livelihood, and we invest money after money, billions of dollars to educate the young, to be competitive with the world. And yet when we get to know one another, we see their lives are a mess. They do not have the same ability to have a skilled life. They're not living skillfully. That's a person who's a fool. Remember, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. You can see then a really stark contrast. The wise person lives in the context of the Lord. This is the proper orientation. When we think of the beginning of knowledge, maybe we're thinking of it chronologically. This is where I start. Yes, this is where we ought to start. But more importantly, it gives us a worldview, the grid of relationship and of worship. So that's what I meant by the heading proper orientation. Proper orientation means a wise person is living under the lordship of God. The foolish person is someone who resists that orientation. Oh, they have a worldview, and oh, they have an orientation, but it doesn't emerge from the revelation that we have in the Lord. Well, let's talk a moment about how Proverbs differs from, and wisdom, like Job, Ecclesiastes, how it differs from other parts of the Bible. Because there's a tendency on the part of people to come to literature and it's kind of flat. You just interpret the Bible the same way instead of recognizing different kinds of literature. I don't know why we suspend our intuitive knowledge of different kinds of literature. Say, for example, you have these clues in our language. One would be a make-believe, a novel, a fantasy, once upon a time. Well, immediately you know not to take that as an Associated Press report. Although sometimes we may think the AP's report's a little fantastic. Nonetheless, we have these clues, and we automatically know how to differentiate genre. Genre, as a term that's often used, I found it's very convenient now with young people in my classes because they talk about the different genre of music. These are different kinds of music. But we have different kinds of literature. And you start confusing poetry and law and narrative and gospel and epistle and prophecy and of all things apocalyptic like in Daniel and the book of Revelation, you can really make a mess. Well, when it comes to Proverbs, what we need to understand, wisdom in general, is that they are not designed to be prophecy or promise. They are designed to teach general truths, recognizing that there are exceptions. But the truths that they teach are the most common causes and effects. Let me give you the classic example of Job. Job's friends had a perverted understanding of the way God works with his people. They thought that God was locked into a system of if you behave correctly, it's amazing how many people think this today in our churches, but if you behave yourself and behave correctly, then you're going to have a great life. On the other hand, if you misbehave, then you're going to have a terrible life. Isn't that what Proverbs teaches? Yes, generally, but there are always exceptions to this in the way in which God works. Well, in the case of Job, was it because Job was misbehaving? Was it because he was a wicked man? On the contrary, Job went through the trials and tribulations of his life because he was a godly man. You remember how it was that the adversary, Satan, was here and yonder, and God says, what have you been up to? And so Satan responds, I've been going around the world. And it was God who pointed out Job. This is where I tongue-in-cheek say to my students that that's when I want to be anonymous, in heaven. But have you seen my servant Job? Now the thing about it is that Job and the friends of Job, they weren't there. They didn't read the opening 2 chapters of Job. We do. The authors brought us into heaven. We have a heavenly perspective, a divine perspective. And what we find through the remainder of the book, until the conclusion, is the earthly perspective. And there is not a correlation between the way God viewed Job and the way Job's friends viewed Job. Job was an exception. They thought that all the calamities had come upon Job because he had in some way offended God. Through maybe his secret immoral life or the way he had mistreated the poor or something of that sort. Now, Job didn't deny the fact that he was a sinner, as we would describe. But he denied the fact that he had actually committed some criminal act, some grave transgression that would merit this kind of response from God. So we get the adjudication on the part of God when he speaks out of the whirlwind, out of the storm. And at the end of the book, you remember it says, to the friends, God says, you have spoken wrongly about Job. And in fact, he calls upon Job to offer up prayer and sacrifice as a means of atonement for the sins of his friends. What I'm saying is that paradigm of what you do wrong is going to lead surely to curse and the positive side. You can't start with what appears to be a person under the judgment of God and necessarily conclude, well, they must have done something wrong. An example of that's in John 9. When the audience asked Jesus regarding the blind man, you remember those? Is he blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? And Jesus said, neither. He's blind for the glory of God. And of course, he heals. You just can't assume then that when it comes to that cause and effect, that it's always going to be a locked-in system. Precisely, this cause leads to that effect. There are exceptions. We'll see that here in a moment. Let's see how the wisdom worked. Number one, applied knowledge and insight. Turn with me to Proverbs 26. We actually have evidence of how wisdom has to do with application, and that circumstances will dictate how we are to apply that wisdom. You see verses 4 and 5. Have you found this before? This is rather striking, isn't it? If you look at verse 4, chapter 26. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself. Verse 5. Answer. Wait a second. Didn't it say in verse 4, don't answer? Now in verse 5 it says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Well, you have to decide circumstantially as to whether you should answer or not answer. There's no absolute truth here. It's relevant in terms of the circumstance. Sometimes we answer a fool, and sometimes we don't answer a fool. And so if you don't answer a fool, it's most likely because, well, there's the temptation, the opportunity for you to become like a fool. On the other hand, there are people who are really teachable. And there you want to rescue that person. That was what I said earlier about a true dialogue partner. And that's how you have to deal with application or skill living. It's going to be circumstantial. It'd be simpler if it were all absolutes, but it is simply not so. And that's why we find the book of James, again, where God encourages us to ask for wisdom in times of difficulty and perplexity, and that God is very liberal when it comes to giving his wisdom. Now, how does this actually work? Well, within Proverbs we have a testimony, autobiographical word from one of the sages. And if you turn to chapter 24. Chapter 24, verses 30 through 34. So here's what the sage says, the wise man. I went past the field of the sluggard, past the vineyard of the man who lacks judgment. So you can see the parallel. Field and vineyard. Sluggard and the person who lacks judgment. So this is just his daily routines, his daily activities. He's just walking along, traveling somewhere probably, reflecting upon life. But what is important is that this bleeds into 31, where it's grounded in observation. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. So that's the power of observation. They would observe the way nature works, the way creation works. And then the second step is found in verse 32. This is introspection, or you might say reflection. This is contemplative. We're so busy. If we could just pause and think before we act, think before we speak, have that meditative moments in life where we are reflective. I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw. So, observation, contemplation, and then now we're going to go to the proverb. He pens this proverb. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands, and what will happen to you? See, that's the cause. Here's the effect. Poverty will come on you similarly, like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Well, if you're a sluggard, if you lack judgment, you're going to be hungry because you are not applying yourself to the upkeep of your vineyard and your field because of laziness. And as you know, that's one of the strong virtues in the book of Proverbs, is teaching the importance of industry and activity. Well, let's think about this for a moment. Let's imagine an illustration in our own neighborhood. Have you noticed, well, you may have a special neighborhood, but I've noticed in the various places I live that there's usually within a block or two of my house one that is just really not very attractive. It's unkept. The house needs to be painted, gutters need to be replaced. I may be talking to myself. The gutters need to be replaced. The yard is rarely cut. The bushes are going every which direction. And cars are cars. The people are parking their cars in the yard. That's when you know that your house just dropped about $50,000 or more in value. What would be the potential causes of why that house is in such a state? Why do you say, man, what a bum lives there? Why don't those people get their act together? It's really hurting the rest of us. Could well be the truth. Sounds like a likelihood. But can you think of other reasons, other scenarios as to why that house needs upkeep? Think of anything? Just volunteer.
Senior adult lady.
What's that?
Senior adult lady living.
A senior adult lady.
Her husband's dead.
Yes. A widow who doesn't really have the income or the family. It'd be great to have a grandson who would come over and do all that. That's right. In other words, there could be a different causation for that. And we have to be careful not to condemn. Can you think of another scenario? I was thinking of one of someone who may be laid up in the hospital. You know, some people go to the hospital for months. So it may be due to some that sort. Or maybe
Divorce.
someone who has a disability, obviously.
Divorce.
Yes, that's right.
Single parent working.
Yes. Just, it could be that that's a vacant house as well. So there's a lot of possibilities. Generally, you could say a bum. A lazy, no good person. But there may be other reasons, as was the case with Job. So that's how wisdom actually works. But we have to be careful not to straitjacket God in the way he works. There's going to be circumstantial changes. Now, do any of you have any questions? We're running out of our time. It doesn't appear like we're going to get too deep into the next page. Yes.
One point on, back in Proverbs 1, was it verse 3, the word receiving instructions? Did you say that that is the word to know?
Yes.
Yada, is it?
Yes. Very good.
So it,
Hebrew scholar, right?
no, I just know that one word, so I have to throw it out. But, so what I picked up from you from that, and what I really want to kind of carry away from here, is that this receiving instruction is not necessarily sitting in the classroom hearing words as much as it is you're experiencing this prudent behavior, and it's probably, when we give it to the young, it is passed generationally, or
Yes.
also the church is a place where it is passed on to the next.
Yes.
They experience this knowledge by
Yes.
seeing it in the life of someone
Yes.
else.
It's modeled.
Yes, and this is what you'll find in the King James Version. Adam knew his wife Eve, she conceived for a child. So it is used in that way for personal relationship, and as you're saying there, that it is much more than just simply receiving information. I like the word embrace, because then it has the idea of assimilation. To embrace is, what's that word here? Receiving means to adopt, to embrace.
And I think that's where we've probably failed some of our other generations, younger generations perhaps, is that we haven't passed on that this is something to embrace. I like your approach here with that.
Yes. You have a question?
Well, kind of a statement and a question. At the same time, we're given this material to ponder over and to think. So it's not just what we give our children. We have got to take advantage of the divine material that we have.
Yes.
So, just a funny thing, whenever we deal with Proverbs, my mother, when I was a child, she would make the comment that, I read a proverb a day. And I thought, that's interesting. But by putting herself into the Proverbs, even on a devotional level, she's thinking about the principles that God has related to, and can take those principles into her daily life.
Yes.
Now, I don't know how well she may or may not have done
Yes.
that.
Yes.
But even with our young folks, yes, we have to pass on, but we've got to pass on biblical concepts. And if you think in terms of our religious education, how often are we going to take our young people or even our adults into Proverbs and teach them
Yes.
the principles that we've just been talking about right
Yes.
here? So we can't subtract, we can't learn the lesson as teachers and say we're going to do it. We've got to actually take them to the divine and let them interact with what God has given
Yes.
us.
It is a little peculiar, isn't it, that we, in ministry and church leadership, we struggle so much, we think, to make, I don't like that word make, but that's what we said, to make our message, to make the Bible relevant in our culture. Well, we don't have to make it. It is relevant. It meets the deeper needs of life. But isn't it interesting that such books as Proverbs is rarely tapped? And yet, it would really help people at that ground level of living their lives day to day. It touches on every aspect of life. such as your financial resources, your relationship with superiors or inferiors, things of that order. And it is so rich in a way it can help people reorganize in terms of a worldview, like is what you're speaking of. Have an orientation that every aspect of their life is under the governance of the Lord. That He's attentive to every aspect. But it doesn't look like we got to the second page, does it? Is there any last question? I think we could take one more question before we move on to our break. Bill, am I doing right here?
You're doing great.
Okay. All right. Well, God bless. Have a great remainder of the morning and day.
When you said at the end, the government of our lives,
Mm-hmm.
in Isaiah, you know, the verse about and the government will be on His shoulders.
Yeah.
Like that's a really good, like, the government of your life should be there.
Yeah. The Lord God.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you for coming.
I didn't hear the introduction as far as where are you from?
I'm in Beeson Divinity
Okay.
School at Sanford.
Good, right here,
That's right.
local.
And I was telling Bill that Bob Hatfield is